In the bustling city of Birmingham, a small but rising corporation was expanding its presence in the industry. Tucked in a high-rise office building, this company thrived on order, hard work, and ambition. However, beneath its clean-cut, professional exterior lurked an unspoken tension that only some could feel. One of those people was James. James was a young black man in his early 30s, passionate, intelligent, and hardworking. He had a quiet, resilient strength, the kind that often went unnoticed yet held immense power. James had been with the company for 3 years, dedicating his energy to his tasks with discipline and a loyalty that anyone could admire. He came in early, left late, and often picked up extra tasks that no one else wanted. But he was not immune to the harsh undercurrents that sometimes seemed to pulse through the walls of his workplace. James's boss, Mr. Carter, was a man known for his stern, no-nonsense demeanor. He was in his mid-50s with sharp features and a voice that could quiet an entire room. Mr. Carter was old-fashioned in his ways. He kept his emotions guarded, rarely showing warmth or humor, and expected absolute obedience. Beneath his exterior, however, there was something else, an underlying bias that lingered in his actions and words, though he would never openly admit it. His discrimination showed up subtly, hidden behind the mask of professionalism, but recognizable to those on the receiving end. James had sensed Mr. Carter's bias from the very beginning. In small ways, it appeared as dismissive comments or the way Mr. Carter would brush off his ideas, no matter how practical or innovative they were. When James brought up a new approach or suggested a solution to a problem, Mr. Carter would sometimes ignore him completely, only to praise the same idea when a different colleague suggested it a few days later. Over time, James learned to pick his battles, realizing that his efforts and loyalty didn't guarantee the recognition he deserved. The office environment itself was a reflection of this subtle exclusion. The company prided itself on being a modern, inclusive workspace. Posters with slogans about diversity and team spirit lined the walls, but a closer look told a different story. The executive floor, where Mr. Carter and other senior managers worked, was predominantly occupied by people who looked very much like Mr. Carter. In his own department, James was often the only black employee at team meetings, and his presence sometimes felt like an unspoken anomaly. Despite these quiet injustices, James chose to focus on his work, telling himself that hard work would eventually speak for itself. His workspace was a small cubicle in the far corner of the office. It was neat, organized, and held a few personal items, a framed photo of his family, a motivational quote, and a small plant. The space was reflective of who James was: grounded, diligent, and motivated by more than just career ambitions. He found pride in his work, and he believed in contributing to something greater. But every day as he settled into his workspace, he couldn't ignore the feeling that he was treated differently, like he was an outsider in a place he had tried so hard to belong. The tension was subtle but unmistakable. Mr. Carter's dismissive gestures, his tendency to give others the praise James deserved, the way he called on others to lead projects even when James was more qualified. These instances were small but cumulative, creating a slow-brewing tension that only those who faced such biases understood. Yet James, with his quiet resilience, endured these moments, determined not to let them derail his ambition. His focus was on his work, and he trusted that his efforts would be recognized in time. But there was something more to James's story, something that few knew. He came from a family with deep roots and accomplishments that stretched back generations. His father was a well-respected leader in their community, and his family had made countless contributions to civil rights causes. James had grown up with values instilled by a legacy of resilience and service. He was proud of his heritage and carried that pride with him, though he never felt the need to broadcast it. His identity was quietly woven into his character, something he honored privately without seeking approval or validation. In the quiet corners of the office, whispers sometimes circulated about James, hinting that he might be connected to someone influential or that he had an impressive background that he chose not to speak about. Mr. Carter, however, either didn't hear or didn't care to know. To him, James was just another employee, one who he often viewed with a hint of disapproval, though he would never explicitly show it. For James, each day was a test of patience and professionalism. He had learned to ignore the comments, the glances, the moments when he felt like he was being overlooked, telling himself that his work was his voice. Yet, a part of him sometimes wondered if the day would come when he could show his true worth and put the quiet injustice to rest. He had spent years working hard, determined to rise above, to earn his place, and to let his achievements speak for themselves. Have you ever felt overlooked or treated unfairly because of who you are? Have you ever been in a place where your efforts were disregarded? Share your story in the comments below, and if you're ready to hear more stories of resilience and courage, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Together, let's support and learn from one another's journeys. The day began like any other, with the usual buzz of activity filling the office. James was seated at his desk, organizing a set of data reports he'd spent weeks perfecting. It was the quarterly review meeting, and he'd been asked to present his findings to the department heads, including Mr. Carter. James knew his report was strong. He had poured hours of focus into the details, even staying late on multiple occasions to ensure the work was meticulous. But he'd hardly begun presenting when Mr. Carter's dismissive voice cut through his explanation. "James, this approach seems a bit elementary, don't you think?" Mr. Carter's words dripped with disdain. "We're trying to operate at a high level here. Perhaps you should take some time to really understand the intricacies before you present." The words stung, not only because they undermined James's hard work, but because they struck at the core of his professional worth. His calm exterior barely held, his jaw tightened, and he had to clench his hands under the table to keep his composure. He wanted to defend his analysis, to explain the thoroughness and accuracy of his work, but he knew that speaking up in front of his peers would likely be met with even more condescension. Instead, he nodded, forcing a polite response. "Thank you for the feedback, Mr. Carter. I'll review it." Inside, though, a fire burned. James felt embarrassed, frustrated, and humiliated all at once. He had done his best work, and it was dismissed as though it were nothing. His mind whirled with anger, and he wondered why he even bothered putting in the extra hours if his efforts were only going to be ridiculed. But he reminded himself of his goals, his family's pride, the sacrifices he'd made to get here, and the vision he held for his future. He took a deep breath, reaffirming his resolve to stay calm and focused. One difficult comment wouldn't break him. He had been through worse before. Yet the situation only seemed to worsen. Mr. Carter began assigning James additional tasks that were far beyond his role, piling work that could have easily been distributed among the team. On more than one occasion, James found himself working on projects that weren't even remotely aligned with his job description. It felt like Mr. Carter was testing him, pushing boundaries to see how much James would tolerate. There were weekends spent buried in files, weekdays that stretched far beyond regular office hours. Each time he completed one task, 3 more appeared. James noticed that his colleagues felt uncomfortable with what was happening. A few of them approached him during lunch breaks or in quiet corners of the office. "It's unfair, you know," another coworker, glancing over his shoulder, Lisa, as if to ensure a similar sentiment heard. "He's James, I honestly don't know how you're doing this. We all see it. If it were me, I'd have walked out." "Wrong. It's like he's testing you, waiting for you to break." These conversations were both comforting and disheartening. On one hand, James felt validated, he wasn't imagining the mistreatment. But on the other hand, their sympathy highlighted just how little power any of them had to change the situation. They saw the unfairness, but they too were afraid to challenge Mr. Carter. James's sense of isolation grew. Though he valued the support of his colleagues, he felt the weight of standing alone in this struggle. No one could fight this battle for him. Each night he returned home, drained but determined. He couldn't quit, not now. He had responsibilities, dreams, and a purpose he wasn't willing to abandon. He thought about his family, his parents' sacrifices to support his education, and the example he wanted to set for his younger siblings. He reminded himself that his strength was in his resilience. And then there was Mr. Roberts. An executive from a different department, Mr. Roberts was a tall, quiet man with an air of authority that even Mr. Carter seemed to respect. He rarely spoke to James directly, but observed him on several occasions, his eyes thoughtful, almost as if he were studying the situation from afar. Mr. Roberts would sometimes be present during meetings where Mr. Carter openly criticized James, but he never intervened. It was as though he saw what was happening but chose not to interfere, creating an air of mystery and intrigue. James wasn't sure what to make of Mr. Roberts' silence. On one hand, he wondered if Mr. Roberts sympathized with him but was hesitant to step in due to the complexities of office politics. On the other, he considered that perhaps Mr. Roberts' silence was merely indifference. It was a puzzle, and in a way it fueled James's curiosity and frustration. Why observe but remain uninvolved? The pressure mounted, both in his workload and his emotional state. There were nights when James lay awake, staring at the ceiling, questioning whether it was worth it. He thought about quitting, about walking into Mr. Carter's office and handing in his resignation. The thought was tempting, almost a relief. But every time he imagined leaving, he felt a twinge of defeat. He didn't want to give Mr. Carter the satisfaction of seeing him walk away. More than anything, he wanted to prove to himself that he could endure, that his resilience was stronger than the prejudice that sought to undermine him. The thought of his family kept him going. He envisioned their faces, their unwavering belief in him, the pride in their voices when they spoke about his achievements. He thought about the legacy he wanted to create, a legacy that would honor his heritage, his identity, and the struggles his ancestors had faced. This was more than a job, it was a journey toward a vision he held dear. One evening, as he gathered his belongings to leave, Mr. Roberts approached him. It was the first time they had ever spoken directly. "You've been working late hours, haven't you?" James Mr. Roberts asked, his voice measured and calm. "Yes," Sir James replied, cautiously. He didn't know if this was another test or simply an observation. Mr. Roberts gave a slight nod, his expression unreadable. "Keep up the good work," he said, before turning and walking away. The words were simple, almost too brief to carry any meaning, but something in Mr. Roberts's tone struck James. It wasn't praise, but there was a subtle hint of acknowledgement, as though Mr. Roberts knew more than he was letting on. This brief exchange filled James with a mix of hope and uncertainty. He wasn't sure what Mr. Roberts's intentions were, but he felt that perhaps his efforts hadn't gone entirely unnoticed. Back at his desk, James reflected on his journey so far. He had endured many hardships, both spoken and unspoken. He had faced prejudice, isolation, and injustice, yet he was still standing. The struggle was exhausting, yes, but it hadn't broken him. If anything, it had only strengthened his resolve. This was his story, and he would see it through. He knew that one day, whether soon or far into the future, his resilience would be rewarded. What would you do in James's position? Would you confront the boss or stay quiet? Would you persevere or walk away? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe. Let's stand together against adversity and support one another in our journeys. It was another high-stakes day at the office. The quarterly performance review meeting was in full swing, with all the department heads present. James had prepared diligently, despite the pressure that had been building over recent months. He felt a tinge of apprehension, knowing how meetings with Mr. Carter tended to play out. Yet he reminded himself to stay calm and focused. Today would be just another day, he thought, another opportunity to show his dedication. As James began presenting his report, detailing the successes and areas for improvement in his department, Mr. Carter's expression shifted. His frown deepened with every sentence James spoke, his disapproval more evident than ever. And then, in the middle of James's explanation, Mr. Carter abruptly interrupted. "That's enough, James," he said, his tone cutting through the room. "I don't think you understand the kind of expectations we have here. We need people who can think on a higher level, who bring real insight to the table. I'm not sure if you're capable of handling these responsibilities." The room fell silent. James felt his face flush as his confidence wavered. He opened his mouth, trying to find the words to respond, to defend his work, but the moment slipped past, and Mr. Carter continued. "In fact," Mr. Carter added, leaning back in his chair with a smug expression, "I think it might be best if you leave your current role. There are others here who can manage it with the level of sophistication we require." It was an unfair statement, one that ignored all of James's contributions and singled him out over a minor oversight that could have easily been overlooked. But it was Mr. Carter's next words that truly stung. "This company deserves excellence, James. Maybe you'd be better suited somewhere less demanding," he remarked with a thin smile, barely masking the prejudice behind his words. James felt a surge of anger mixed with deep sadness. The years of hard work, the extra hours, the sacrifices he'd made, all of it dismissed in a single moment. He looked around, noticing the awkward glances from his colleagues, some sympathetic, others too afraid to meet his gaze. He wanted to speak up, to tell Mr. Carter that he was wrong, but he knew that any defense he offered would likely be met with even more ridicule. With a heavy heart, James rose from his seat. His mind raced with the weight of this dismissal. The moment felt surreal, like he was trapped in a bad dream. He turned, preparing to leave the room, his pride urging him to keep his head high despite the humiliation he felt. As he reached the door, a calm but firm voice stopped him. "James, wait." And James turned to see Mr. Roberts standing up from his seat, his expression serious. Mr. Roberts had always been a quiet figure in the office, someone who observed from the background without directly involving himself in day-to-day affairs. But today, there was a new intensity in his gaze. Mr. Roberts walked to the front of the room, his eyes not on Mr. Carter but on James. He paused, looking around the room at the surprised faces of the department heads, before finally speaking. "I believe there's something you all should know about James," he began, his tone steady and commanding. "James isn't just an employee here. He is family to me, my nephew." The revelation was like a thunderclap in the room. Mr. Carter's face lost all color, his mouth opening slightly as he struggled to process what he had just heard. The other managers exchanged astonished glances, the gravity of Mr. Roberts's words settling over them like a heavy blanket. Mr. Roberts continued, his voice calm but piercing. "James comes from a long line of people who have contributed to this company's history, people who were instrumental in laying its foundations. His family has ties to the origins of this very business. But James never felt the need to use his background as a stepping stone. He wanted to work here based on his own merits, to build his own path, and I respected him for it." A stunned silence filled the room as the weight of Mr. Roberts's words sank in. James felt a wave of emotions wash over him, surprise, relief, and a quiet triumph. All this time he had worked tirelessly, taking on extra responsibilities, enduring Mr. Carter's bias and unfair treatment, never once mentioning his connection to Mr. Roberts or his family's legacy. He had wanted his work to speak for itself, and now, at the moment when he was about to walk away in defeat, the truth had emerged. Mr. Carter's expression was one of utter disbelief, mingled with a dawning shame. He blinked, seemingly replaying every moment he had dismissed, criticized, or undermined James. Scenes of past encounters flashed through his mind, the times he had ignored James's ideas, brushed off his hard work, and overlooked his dedication. In that moment he realized that he had been judging James based on assumptions rather than his capabilities or character. Mr. Roberts took a step closer to Mr. Carter, his voice filled with a quiet authority. "I don't think you understand the talent you have in James. He has shown more dedication and perseverance in his role than many others would have. It's unfortunate that your prejudice has blinded you to his potential." Mr. Carter shifted uncomfortably, his face flushed with embarrassment. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The usual confidence, the smug superiority he often displayed, had vanished, leaving only the hollow shell of a man who had finally been forced to confront his own biases. As Mr. Carter's silence stretched, James felt a swell of pride within him. The years of hard work, the challenges he had endured, had all been worth it. He glanced around the room, meeting the eyes of his colleagues, many of whom now looked at him with newfound respect. This was the moment he had been waiting for, not in the sense of retribution, but as a moment of validation, a reminder that his worth had always been there, whether acknowledged or not. He took a deep breath, a sense of peace washing over him. The sadness and anger he had felt only moments ago were replaced by a calm understanding. He had risen above, had held onto his integrity, and in the end it had been his character that prevailed. Mr. Roberts turned to James, his expression softening. "I'm proud of you, James. You've shown immense strength and dignity, even when faced with unfair treatment. This company needs people like you, people who stand for something." James nodded, his heart full. He didn't need to say anything, his silence spoke volumes. This was his moment of quiet triumph, a victory born not out of confrontation but of resilience. Turning back to the room, Mr. Roberts addressed the team. "Let this be a lesson to all of us. We talk about values like integrity and respect, but it's our actions that truly matter. Let's ensure that we honor those values in the way we treat each other." With that, Mr. Roberts placed a hand on James's shoulder, signaling for him to stay. Mr. Carter, humbled and visibly shaken, looked down, realizing the magnitude of his error. James stood tall, no longer the overlooked employee. He was, in that moment, a symbol of strength, of resilience, and of the quiet dignity that comes from holding true to one's values. And as he looked out over the room, he knew that he had won something far greater than validation. He had earned respect, not just from others, but from himself. The climactic moment had passed, but its impact lingered. James's story wasn't just about one man's triumph over prejudice, it was a testament to the power of character, to the resilience that can withstand any injustice. And as he walked back to his seat, he felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing he had taken the high road and had come out stronger for it. This was his story, one he could carry with pride. The days following the revelation brought a noticeable shift in the office. Mr. Carter's once overbearing presence seemed to diminish. His previously commanding tone was now tempered with a subdued quietness. His steps were slower, his gaze less direct, as if a veil had been lifted from his eyes, showing him a version of himself that he hadn't seen before, one tainted by prejudice, masked behind layers of authority and power. When he passed James in the hallways, he no longer avoided eye contact or pretended not to notice him. Instead, he offered a respectful nod, acknowledging James in a way he never had before. This shift in Mr. Carter's behavior was gradual but unmistakable. In meetings, his remarks toward James were cautious, almost deferential. Gone were the critical, dismissive comments. In their place were neutral questions, and an attentiveness he had previously reserved only for the employees he favored. It was clear that he was aware of the weight of his past actions and was taking deliberate steps to address them. But the change wasn't simply about guilt, it was rooted in a newfound understanding, a glimpse into the person James truly was and the strength he had shown. Around the office, the ripple effect was felt by everyone. Employees who had once maintained a respectful distance from James began engaging with him more openly. Some of them expressed their admiration, not just for his work, but for the patience and resilience he had shown under pressure. The whispered acknowledgments, the subtle nods of respect, and the supportive smiles in passing made James feel more welcome in a place that had often felt indifferent to his presence. In response to what had happened, Mr. Roberts took a strong stance, emphasizing the need for a more inclusive and fair work environment. He implemented diversity training across the company, a program designed to challenge the hidden biases that could seep into decision-making and workplace dynamics. The training was designed not to accuse or shame, but to encourage self-reflection and foster a deeper understanding of the impact of unconscious biases. Through these sessions, employees, including Mr. Carter, were encouraged to explore their assumptions and consider how their attitudes affected others. James noticed Mr. Carter sitting in the front row during these sessions, paying close attention and even taking notes. It was a humbling experience for Mr. Carter, who had always prided himself on his ability to lead. Yet now, as he listened to discussions on respect and empathy, he understood that his leadership had lacked the very qualities that make a workplace not just productive but humane. In the following weeks, James began to notice subtle yet powerful changes in his interactions with Mr. Carter. During one particular meeting, Mr. Carter hesitated before addressing James, carefully choosing his words. Instead of the dismissive tone he once used, he asked for James's opinion on a project's direction, genuinely interested in hearing his thoughts. It was a small gesture, yet for James, it represented a shift that was long overdue. One afternoon, Mr. Carter approached James in the break room. There was an awkward pause before he finally spoke. "James," he began, his voice low, "I just want you to know that. I regret the way I've treated you. I didn't see you for who you are, and I allowed my biases to cloud my judgment. I'm truly sorry." James looked at him, studying the lines of humility etched into Mr. Carter's expression. It wasn't an easy moment for either of them, yet it felt necessary, a bridge built over years of misunderstanding. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," James replied, offering a polite nod. He didn't need to say much more, the acknowledgement was enough. He wasn't interested in grudges or lingering resentment. He was simply grateful that the truth had been seen, and that, finally, a sense of fairness had been restored. James's relationship with his coworkers also grew in new directions. Those who had once stayed silent now showed their support openly, acknowledging the strength he had shown in a way that felt sincere. Lisa, one of his colleagues who had always shown subtle support, approached him one day, her eyes bright with admiration. "James, I can't tell you how much respect I have for you. You handled everything with such grace, even when things were tough. I'm glad to see you getting the recognition you've always deserved." James smiled, feeling a quiet warmth spread within him. He'd never sought praise, only fairness. But the recognition from his peers felt validating, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, his perseverance had left a mark. For Mr. Carter, the journey was one of deep reflection. He spent his evenings pondering how he had allowed himself to fall into the trap of judgment and bias. It was a painful realization to understand that he had placed James in a box, defined not by his abilities but by his own misguided assumptions. Mr. Carter knew he couldn't undo the past, but he could change his path forward. And in doing so, he hoped to rebuild the respect he had lost, not just from James but from the entire team. In quiet moments, James reflected on everything that had transpired. He thought about the long hours, the nights he had spent questioning whether his efforts would ever be recognized, and the days when he had felt like an outsider. But now, standing in a workplace where he was seen for his true worth, he understood something fundamental about himself. His value was not defined by others' perceptions. It wasn't contingent on Mr. Carter's approval or anyone else's acknowledgement. His worth came from within, from his dedication, integrity, and the strength he had drawn from his heritage. James's journey was no longer about proving himself. It had transformed into a story of self-acceptance and quiet confidence. The recognition he received now was a bonus, a byproduct of the resilience he had cultivated through years of perseverance. And as he walked through the office, greeted by nods of respect and warm smiles, he felt a profound sense of peace, knowing that he had held on to his values even when it had been difficult. He thought about his family, the legacy he carried, and the pride he felt in honoring their sacrifices. This wasn't just a victory for him, it was a tribute to everyone who had ever faced adversity and kept going. He was part of something bigger, a story of resilience that extended far beyond the walls of this office. In the end, the workplace was forever changed, not because of a single event, but because of the strength of character that James had demonstrated. The shift in dynamics, the newfound respect from his colleagues, and the transformation in Mr. Carter were all part of a larger lesson about empathy, fairness, and the importance of seeing people for who they truly are. James's journey reminded everyone that true change often starts with small, quiet acts of courage, and that the greatest victories are those won not with confrontation, but with grace. A few weeks after the climactic revelation, life at the office had shifted in ways James hadn't anticipated. The news of his quiet resilience and the unexpected family ties he'd kept hidden for years had left a lasting impact, reshaping not only Mr. Carter's views but the entire office's culture. Mr. Roberts, true to his word, had taken swift steps to make the workplace a better place for everyone. The company had instituted policies that promoted diversity and inclusion, ensuring that every employee's voice would be valued, regardless of their background or position. Amid these changes, James was informed of his promotion. It was a moment he had long hoped for, not for the title or the pay, but for the recognition of his dedication and capabilities. He had fought a quiet battle for respect, and now it had come to him naturally, as a result of his hard work and integrity. The promotion was a symbol of all he had endured, an acknowledgement not only of his skills but of his character. Not long after receiving the news, James found himself standing in Mr. Carter's office once more. But this time the tone was different. Mr. Carter looked up from his desk, his face softened with humility, as if the weight of the past few weeks had stripped away the arrogance he once carried. He rose, extending his hand with a tentative smile. "James, congratulations on your promotion," he said, his voice laced with sincerity. "I know I haven't treated you fairly, and I can't change that, but I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. I was wrong, and I regret how I handled things. You've shown a strength that I should have seen from the start." James accepted the handshake, nodding with a smile that was both understanding and firm. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," he replied. He paused for a moment, then added, "If there's one thing I've learned, it's that people deserve to be judged by their character, by their actions, not by assumptions. I hope we can all learn to see each other that way." Mr. Carter nodded, a flicker of respect in his eyes. He seemed to take James's words to heart, as if they were a quiet reminder of the responsibility that came with his position. It was a genuine moment of reconciliation, not just between two colleagues, but between two people who had come to understand the importance of fairness and respect. Back on the office floor, James felt the transformation in the air. His colleagues greeted him warmly, and he felt a renewed sense of belonging, not as a black man working against unspoken biases, but as an integral part of a team that valued him for who he was. People approached him, not out of sympathy but with genuine admiration, some even sharing their own stories of challenges they had faced. His story had become an inspiration, a reminder that standing up with dignity could indeed change hearts and minds. James also found himself with new responsibilities in his role, responsibilities that allowed him to make a difference for others who might face similar struggles. He took his role seriously, committed to helping his team flourish, to being a supportive figure for others who might feel marginalized or overlooked. He was determined to use his journey as a force for positive change, ensuring that no one else would have to feel alone or undervalued in their work environment. Mr. Roberts, inspired by the shift James had catalyzed, introduced a series of company-wide initiatives that reinforced inclusivity. Workshops, open forums, and mentorship programs were launched to ensure that everyone's voice could be heard. The workplace became a space where diversity wasn't just a policy on paper but a lived experience, a source of strength and unity. The impact was visible. Teams collaborated more effectively, conversations became richer, and everyone felt a sense of ownership in contributing to a respectful, empowering culture. At the end of the workday, James returned home, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. He stepped into his small but cozy apartment, looking around at the framed photos of his family that lined his living room. As he sat down, he felt a quiet pride settling over him, a feeling of peace that had eluded him during the struggles he'd faced. His mind drifted back over the past few years, reflecting on the quiet endurance he had carried through the difficult moments. He thought of the nights he'd stayed up questioning whether his hard work would ever be recognized, the days when he had felt invisible despite his best efforts. Now, all of it felt worth it. His thoughts returned to the beginning, to the values his family had instilled in him, the legacy of strength, resilience, and dignity that he carried. They had taught him that true power didn't come from anger or confrontation, but from integrity and perseverance. His journey had proven that even the hardest battles could be won with patience, and that real change often came in quiet moments of courage. As he looked out his window, watching the city lights flickering in the distance, he felt that he had grown not just as an employee or as a team member, but as a person. He understood that his worth had never been tied to others' opinions. It was something deeper, something that came from his values, from his dedication to himself and those he cared about. His journey had been a testament to what could be achieved when one chose to stay true to their principles, even in the face of adversity. James knew that the changes he had helped bring about would extend beyond him, impacting others who might come after him, and that thought filled him with hope. He had turned his challenges into triumphs, not through retaliation but through resilience, and in doing so he had created a legacy of respect and fairness for himself and for those around him. What part of James's journey resonated most with you? Have you ever faced a situation where you felt unseen or undervalued? Share your experiences with us and remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Together, let's stand up for dignity and create spaces where everyone's worth is recognized.